Hi, folks. I'm Jen Thompson. I head up the social science team along with Meredith Niles at University of Vermont. And I'm at the University of Georgia. What I hope to do today is talk through some of those orange lines that Stephen put up on his screen, the sort of weaving through of the social science in this project. And as many of you who have been at some of the previous meetings might remember, I've talked about and Orly stressed that this is an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaboration, right? So how do we advance the science and simultaneously address societal problems? And in this case, really how to support farmers using cover crops effectively as possible, advancing sustainable ag in a way that's like sophisticated and data driven, but also accessible and usable for people on the ground. Next slide, please. So many of you have seen this slide before, and I'm not going to spend much time on it. And I just want to note that the scope of our work started with a focus on farmers, still beyond the kind of general survey approach, which has its place, but building on what we've learned in previous surveys to develop, to figure out what we can learn from our farmer network, our on-farm partners, to help support the adoption and development of expertise in cover crops in a more sort of tailored and nuanced ways. And with the SASCAP, our scope expanded to really focus on the entire network of research. And so the partnerships among us, that kind of transdisciplinary relationships woven through our entire network, and our relationships with external partners as well, including industry, but also extension outreach, farmers in the PSA network doing our on-farm work, and farmers beyond, trying to capture the experiences of farmers who are both cover crop users, sophisticated cover crop users, and everyone along the spectrum. Maybe those who are just beginning to use cover crops, folks who are interested in cover crops, and even folks who think that cover cropping is not for them. So how do we cast a wider net and understand this within the context of what we've called an information ecology, meaning to kind of break down that term that can be a little bit confusing, meaning thinking about this as a complex and dynamic network of information flow. And so how is that affecting the adoption and sophistication of cover crop management? How is our work as researchers in our partnerships with technology makers and industry, how is that supporting this entire initiative? Next slide, please. So to accomplish that, we have brought together a team of researchers who are implementing a real broad suite of approaches that focus on various levels and components of this information ecology. And so when we reassemble these or we triangulate these, will allow us to understand the big picture and then drill down on particular components of the network. So on the left here, I have, you'll notice throughout these slides that I like concentric circles and concentric squares. And so on the left here, you'll see kind of the different levels for impacting cover crop adoption. So our levels of analysis, all the way from on-farm engagement with our on-farm partners, the PSA farmers, all the way throughout to thinking about research and policy, large scale ways of impacting cover crop adoption. And on the right, you'll see the particular methods that we're using to investigate perceptions, practices, and information flows across these levels. And so the colors sort of roughly correspond. So for example, when we're talking about our on-farm partners, that orange dot in the middle on the left, the methods that we're using to really understand their experience and their recommendations for how to make this research more effective our grower think tanks and field assessments. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides, and with some of our partners on the social science team over the next couple of days, we're going to briefly walk through some of these efforts and update you as to where we are with them. So next slide, please. So I am going to start at that center dark orange concentric circle or square, thinking about how are we partnering with our on-farm growers. And so some of this work is being led by Mickey Swisher over at the University of Florida. And along with Kayleen Satano, they are working on grower think tanks and field assessments. And so these two approaches are two approaches working with our PSA farmers, intended to develop really specific recommendations that will guide our research development, both in the immediate, mid, and long term. And these are, and I'll talk a little bit about each, but these are really distinct from the project advisory group in two ways. One is that the recommendations are derived in both of these through a group consensus process. And what that aims to do is develop a small number of really specific recommendations, what to keep in the research, something new to try, and something to get rid of because it's not viewed as important. And so then rather than collecting all kinds of recommendations, soliciting feedback in a really general way, throwing everything into a pot and then us not really knowing what to do with it, Mickey's developed a couple of approaches for really honing that down and asking growers to come to consensus so that what comes out of these process is actionable. And then at the same time, the other part of that handshake then in asking farmers to go through that effort and come to consensus and give us recommendations is the responsibility on our side as researchers to take those recommendations seriously, to act on them, to build and shape our research accordingly, or to take them seriously enough to think through them and explain to them then to farmers why we opted not to, and so to give them that feedback. So in other words, this is really building that relationship and relationship of trust between ourselves and our PSA farmers. So the grower think tank is one PSA farmer from each state. And the idea here is to develop recommendations that will enhance that current and follow-on research for our overall approach to our on-farm research. So this group, which is one farmer from each state, so this year in January 2021, there are growers recruited from the 6 original states. And they'll meet annually. So as of 2022, my understanding is that scope will be broadened to include one farmer from each of the new states developing on-farm or with on-farm research. The field assessments are a more specific focus for one component of the existing research. So in other words, this year, farmers in Florida will come together and focus on reviewing and providing some specific recommendations for Common Experiment 1. And what they'll do there is they'll do some field observations, and based on those field observations, work through a structured conversation to come up with some specific recommendations. Again, something to keep, something to try, and something to get rid of. And this is a really kind of exciting method that that I know that when we shared with Extension and with Heather Darby and Matt Rourke, we're pretty excited about this approach to engaging farmers in on-farm research. So Mickey and her team plan to also offer a few trainings in collaboration with Extension and cover crop councils, so that folks in other states might be able to use and conduct some of these field assessments as well, which will provide us with more feedback on specific experiments in this project. Next slide. So one of the other things that we've been doing, and so folks who are on our on-farm team, some of you have been doing this already, and if you haven't been doing this already, this will be one of the protocols that you're asked to do this year. And you've seen this in some of those meetings. This is the PSA Field History Survey. It's one of the COBO surveys, where our goal is to really characterize PSA farmers' operations and management, both generally across their operation and in the specific study plots. So we're asking them things like total cover crop acres, how long they've been cover cropping, what sources of information do they use already, what are their crop rotations, and so on. And this has we've brought together a number of questions that were both already being used by the on-farm research prior to the social science work, specific to the field, as well as some broader questions that have helped the econ team and have helped our survey team and even the qualitative research, which we're going to get to in a second, to talk about or to understand who our farmers are. So one of the things that has resulted from that is actually the ability to step back and say, okay, who are the farmers, or what are the kinds of farms that we're working with? And we may have a sense of that kind of organically, but it's really important to know and to be able to convey and communicate to ourselves, like, what are the kinds of farmers that we're viewing as our audience here? Who do we include? And in some cases, who maybe is not represented, so that we know really who our research and what the scale of our research is speaking to. And that will also help us to broaden and be more inclusive as a network. So I will actually share a link to this infographic that my graduate student, Melissa Ray, put together, where she took the data from this field history and developed an infographic about our farms. Next slide. So I'm actually going to pass the mic to Melissa, who's going to talk a little bit about the next stage of our research, which is qualitative or a mixed method approach. And as you can see here, or you may or may not be able to see here with the concentric squares, that focuses both on on-farm, some of our on-farm research, but also will reach beyond farmers to our broader network. So Melissa, you want to take it over?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Jen. Yeah, my name is Melissa Ray, and I've been working with PSA in Jen's lab since last summer. And I've been kind of leading the effort on our more crown-focused goals, so identifying barriers and motivating factors to cover cropping so that we can more strategically educate and advocate and market or develop outreach for this practice. So for this research, we're using a methodology known as Q method, or simply Q for short, not the conspiracy theory you may have heard of. Q is a mixed methods approach that we use to evaluate and characterize human subjectivity. So it essentially helps us understand the variety of shared viewpoints that exist around a given topic. The way that this works is that the participants are given a deck of cards, each with a different statement or viewpoint about cover crops, and then they're asked to sort them into a grid, which assigns them a relative value, and then we analyze this data using a program called KenQ. And I'll give everyone a little taste for what the grid looks like and what the products of that analysis look like and how we'll use them here shortly. This slide just gives a quick overview of our timeline on the work. So we began last fall with the development of the Q concourse, which is essentially the universe of statements that exist around cover cropping and commodity systems. So the universe of viewpoints that might exist in that arena. And I built this list, this extremely long, hundreds of statements list, through participant observation at different conferences and meetings, through kind of unofficial interviews with folks in the ag community, and then document analysis of media and literature. So after that, I worked through a coding process to create this really nicely balanced and representative Q set. And the Q set is that deck of statement cards that the participants are then sorting. So from there, we've been moving through our own stages of beta testing and expansion. So we've been testing the Q set and the methodology first with people in our immediate network, and then gradually expanding beyond that. And we've had to kind of, adapt a bit with COVID, because we initially, were planning to do this in person with a lot of folks, and we've had to move to kind of a hybrid model of like virtual and also mailed materials and activities. So this fall, we began a more official pilot of the approach with stakeholders here in Georgia, testing the methodology and the sampling strategy, and then playing around with some early analysis. So over the next 1 to 2 years, we'll be rolling the study out to that larger PSA network, as well as to external farmers and other participants and stakeholders, because we are asking these kind of bigger, broader questions, and we want to make sure we're including people that aren't just within our network to get answers to those, so that we have that representation. You can go to the next slide. So let's take a peek at what Q analysis looks like. For our Georgia pilot thus far, I've been collecting responses from farmers, extension agents, and NRCS employees, and have several other participant categories kind of in the wings. But the first step in our analysis is creating a correlation matrix, which shows how each individual sort relates to any other sort. And then we extract a statistically appropriate number of factors from the data, and each factor represents a shared worldview that's held by the participants associated with that factor. So this image shows how the participant sorts thus far have loaded onto 2 factors. So the factor in light blue on the top is factor 1, and then factor 2 in yellow, the 3 rows on the bottom. And we look at who these when we look at who these 2 factors represent, there's a clear division along participant type, with all of the extension and NRCS folks, which I've labeled ag pros, loading onto factor 1, and then all of the growers loading onto factor 2. So this highlights one of the challenges of Q that I've come across in the literature, and that's how do you design your study so that you aren't simply recreating your participant selection strategy in your results. And we don't want to like cast such a wide net that the results are watered down to something that's kind of obvious or unhelpful. So to combat this issue, once we start rolling this out to the broader network, we're going to be first analyzing grower sorts separately, so that we get that hi-fi, more detailed understanding of the like myriad shared viewpoints that exist among farmers, because they are our primary audience for the research products. And then we'll run a second analysis with the larger data pool, including other stakeholder types. All right, next slide. So this is what the grids actually look like. Each of those little squares is a statement card. And don't worry about being able to read the text on these sorts. It's just to kind of show what the output of the analysis looks like. So after we've extracted the factors, we can create these composite or idealized sorts. And these idealized sorts represent the ways that those people associated with a given factor were similar. So how they're held together and what their shared Q sort would look like, kind of like an average Q sort for those individuals in that factor. So we can look within and among the composite sorts to identify sets of shared and disparate values and perspectives. The highlighted squares here show how the same cards, so the same statements, were ranked significantly differently by the 2 different factors. So for example, a statement highlighted in red shows that the ag pros viewed leased land as a significant impediment to cover crop adoption, whereas the growers did not. The cards in blue and yellow show really disparate attitudes among the 2 groups on incentive programs and their effectiveness and what's already available. So the Q sort data that you're seeing here in the grids, these are further contextualized and validated using demographic data, which we're collecting via Qualtrics survey, and then qualitative data in the form of about 1 hour follow-up interview with each of our participants. So the demographic data will help us identify patterns or demographic commonalities across these shared viewpoints. And then the interview data will deepen our understanding of the extracted viewpoints and hopefully minimize the opportunity for us as researchers to impose our own meanings on a given participant's story. All right, next slide. So what does all of this help us do or create? Well, once we have our final factors identified and interpreted, we'll be able to design and to test out strategies for enhancing adoption of cover that are really tailored to these shared sets of values and attitudes and perceptions. So these graphics here represent hypothetical factor composite sorts and the kind of resultant outreach focus associated with each. Oops, sorry. So this isn't real data, but just examples to show the kinds of information we may find from this analysis and how we might target it. So I think of this strategy kind of similarly to how a social media platform collects information about its users in order to kind of like categorize them and understand a bit about who they are and what they value, and then better engage them using that information. So it's a pretty good fit for precision sustainable agriculture. Yeah, if you have any questions about this work, feel free to get in touch with me or with Jen, and definitely expect emails from our team in the future for help identifying participants in your state. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Next slide. All right, awesome, right there. So I want to mention one other thing, which is that one of the things that we do as that kind of orange line that Stephen had woven through his entire slide is we are doing ongoing participant observation of the entire information ecology. And what that means is we are everywhere. And so, you know, we are oftentimes hanging out at a lot of the PSA team meetings. But and also participating in cover crop outreach and education events. And the objective of this, which comes from kind of my training as an anthropologist and sort of broad training of trying to understand this as a big picture, is to really saturate ourselves in the context of this project, to understand how information is flowing across different teams, identify places where there is consensus and shared knowledge and shared assumptions, but also identify the places where we don't quite understand one another, and we need to work out meanings, which is really typical in transdisciplinary research. We also need to then characterize or make sense of how we work through those differences. When it comes to hanging out, sitting in on outreach and education events, this is also to understand what kinds of priorities or questions that farmers or other attendees have, and what kinds of content or what kinds of information folks who are presenting or teaching or educating about cover crops think is most important. So the idea is to think about the correspondence between those two things. Next slide. So I'm going to stop in just a moment, but I want to point out that Meredith Niles and her team is going to talk next about the network survey. And Heather, Darby, and Matt are going to be talking about extension on Wednesday morning. And then we have the economics team also on Wednesday morning. So I've kind of skipped a number of the components of our larger social science trajectory because you're going to hear more about it going forward. Next slide. So last but not least, I want you to know where to find us. We are, of course, on the internal portal. Under teams, click on social science. Here you will see our big picture objective, including things like our specific work our timeline, our protocols, our meeting notes, and you're always welcome to join us. We meet at 12:30 Eastern on the first Tuesday of the month. So thanks so much. I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
All right, well, thanks, Jen, for that little shout out. I'm Meredith Niles. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Vermont, and I'm presenting on our survey work. And I want to acknowledge my postdoc, Guang Han, who has been working tirelessly on trying to get all of this research out over the past several months. Next slide. So our work is really two quantitative approaches to mapping and understanding the information ecology, both of our own research network, as well as among farmers within PSA and outside of PSA. So I'm going to walk you through both of these approaches today, starting with our PSA network in particular. So we have a forthcoming survey. It's actually sitting in your inbox. Guang sent the email out this morning, and I'll talk you through what that looks like. And we're actually going to allow some time after I present today for everyone on the call to actually go ahead and fill out that survey. Jen piloted it for us. She said it only took her 8 minutes. So hopefully it won't be too long for folks, but I'll walk through each of these today. But the understanding here is that our first network that we're working with is the full PSA research team, partners and farmers. And this survey, as I said, went live today. We're also working on a broader survey with both a random sample of farmers as well as our PSA farmers, which will hopefully go live in 2020. Next slide. So let me walk you through the PSA network first. I think this is animated, Sarah, so you can click, or Brian. So the goal of the network survey among our own team is to really understand how our network is functioning, how our network is sharing information between scientists, extension, farmers, other partners in our group. Next. To identify information sources of cover crops, both among our own team, as well as how people perceive farmers might use information sources around cover crops. Next. To identify effective learning venues around cover crop management that could inform potential extension or other outreach efforts. Next. And to assess the perceptions of cover crop management in terms of benefits and challenges. The main goal here is actually to map the network, which there's a little schematic up here that you can see in the top right, which has little dots and arrows. And in a network analysis, those are representing different people and different connections between people. Next slide. So as you take the survey, I'm going to give you a little bit of preview as to what it will look like. And ultimately what we're asking you to do is to provide your full name, and then to go ahead and click through the top people, 5 to 10 individual team members or partners that you work with or communicate the most with. And we have a little description of how we'll use this information. It won't include names and any publicly released information, but it can help us start to understand how our teams and networks are working together. Next. And once you choose your 5 to 10 individual people, that will populate a separate set of questions for you where you can help us understand if you're sharing or receiving information from these people, how often you're communicating, how important that person is, and the types of topics that you might use or discuss with these people. Next. Next. Yep. And if you work with farmers, we're also asking you some additional questions here. So if you do work with farmers, you'll indicate what states that you actually work with farmers in. Next. Next, sorry, I didn't realize there was so much animation. And then that actually populates the list of farmers, either by farmer last name or by farm name for an individual state. And then you would click on those, next. And then it would populate the same network questions for those individual farmers. Next. So that particular survey, I'm going to have Guang also drop the link to it in the chat box. We pulled the most recent information from our team roster to send that out. So if you didn't receive it, I would suggest one, checking your spam box, it might be there. And then otherwise, Guang is going to drop the link to the survey so that you can actually access it directly from this as well. So shifting gears to talk a little bit about our farmer survey, what we're really interested in thinking about in this component of our work is not just, as Stephen said earlier, whether or not farmers adopt cover crops. There's a long body of research understanding farmers' adoption of sustainable management practices, including cover crops. We're really thinking more carefully in this project, as the farm teams themselves are and as the experiments are, to go beyond just cover crop adoption, to really think about what we're calling in our team adoption sophistication. And so this schematic is one that we've been thinking about that highlights sort of a range of adoptions across how you might think about this issue in social science, from farmers who are not adopting or have any intention to adopt, up to those who might intend to adopt, who have actually adopted, and then this sophistication, which might mean a larger proportion of their acres in cover crops, increasing their varieties, interseeding or other innovative planting techniques, as well as the earliness of when they might plant. We can also think about, aligned with our on-farm trials, a number of other potential sophistications that would come down the pipeline as we consider how some of the on-farm trials are yielding results that could be actionable. So this is the way that we're thinking about adoption as we survey farmers. And the important new contribution to this work is not just this adoption spectrum, but also the inclusion of the network analysis, the inclusion of understanding and thinking about how networks can affect this spectrum of adoption. Next slide. So the goals for our farmer survey are to describe the composition of farmers' networks. So they'll be asking we'll be asking similar questions of the farmers, not populated with specific people, but open-ended. Who are the types of people, or who are the people you communicate most with about cover crops and in what ways? To look at how their different characteristics shape their actual network, what kinds of people are in their network, what kinds of information might flow to it, how those network characteristics themselves then affect the farmer perceptions, decisions, and behaviors related to adoption spectrum, and how potential benefits of cover crops might align with how far along that adoption spectrum people might be, and whether that also aligns with their networks. Next slide. So our timeline here, the PSA network survey has gone live. So hopefully you've got it. It looks like Wong dropped it in the chat box as well. We're hoping to start coding and analyzing this as soon as possible. We are hoping for a 100% response rate among our teams. So thank you all for taking the time to fill out the short survey. We are working on starting to pilot and test the survey with farmers that would go live in January. We will have, let me describe a little bit further that population that we're working with. We are working with our PSA farmers who will receive the farmer survey, as well as a few additional questions related to data privacy and how they might be interested in sharing data across the farmer dashboard and across the network, as well as then a random sample of farmers. And so we're trying to understand how the network structures and adoption spectrum of farmers working very closely within our network may differ or be the same as a random sample of farmers, including non-adopters. We're on target to launch that in mid-January, and also in January then to begin the network survey analysis for our PSA network. We're hoping that the farmer survey would stay open for about 4 weeks with reminders sent, and we hope to begin data analysis and cleaning of the farmer survey in March. And I believe that's the last of my slides. So I'm happy to answer questions. I know Jen and the rest of the team are as well. And thank you all for taking the time to fill out the survey this morning.
One thing that, as we're waiting for any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat box or to just ask them. But one thing that I thought I would mention as as we were waiting for those, is that Meredith's discussion about, farmer sophistication is a really great example of the synergy between the kind of Q-sort and interview work that we're doing at Georgia and the survey and network research being conducted in Vermont, and as well the work in Florida, so that we can understand not only sort of what do we posit as what sophistication looks like in cover crop management, but how do farmers themselves define and experience that kind of sophistication? What are the things they need to know, want to know to become more sophisticated in their management? And how do their networks support them in what ways in developing that kind of sophistication? So whereas, Meredith's work can really help define the prevalence of these and the relationships between them, that some of the qualitative work will also help us make sure that we're defining them in the same way that defining these experience of sophistication in the same way that farmers do.
Yeah, and I'll just add there, as we're waiting for any potential questions people might have, the work of the social science team in scale is also very complementary to understand these things. So the surveys that we're doing, our network has about 150, 160 people in it. The farmers, there's about 100 farmers, PSA farmers. The random sample that we're pulling will be a sample conditional on the size of the state and the number of farmers in the given 20 states that we're working, but will be thousands and thousands of people that this will go out to. So we have a large scale with these surveys that we can understand at a more aggregate level some of these issues. And then Jen and many of the other social scientists are digging deep to better understand and work directly with farmers to really think through some of the more nuance of things. Perhaps there's no questions because everyone is frantically filling out their surveys because they want to have 100% response rate. So thank you.
And they're wondering how on earth it took me 8 minutes. So yeah.
Let's give them a few more minutes, just because I mean we didn't get a lot of questions earlier, and maybe we didn't give people enough time. So maybe we should just, I hate to give us some dead silence time, but maybe we should just give people a few minutes to muster up.
Can I ask a question? This is Deanne Presley.
For sure.
Sure. So I had a question about if we wanted to give our farmers a heads up that they were going to be getting surveyed, or on-farm farmers, when are you expecting that they might want to look for those emails, or how would they be contacted? Would that be email, or can you go explain that a bit?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's actually something that we're thinking about right now. So I'm hoping that I can connect more with the on-farm team as we finalize those pieces. But it would likely be in January would be the time frame. I would love any feedback from people that are working directly with our PSA farmers about strategies that would be helpful to reach out to them, or other ways you suggest reaching out. We did think about trying to possibly utilize the on-farm teams to help sit down with farmers to take the surveys, but unfortunately from an ethics approval, that was going to be really complicated to have to get all of these different field techs and people to have to go through an IRB approval process. So instead, we will be sending it out via email, and we will absolutely give the on-farm teams a heads up before that email goes out, so that you know if the farmer asks you about it. We can also send a copy of that survey to all of the PSA network, so that people know what that survey will look like if you get questions about it from farmers. And then certainly you can direct them to me if there's any questions that they might have. But I appreciate that, because we're definitely trying to make sure we connect and integrate this so it doesn't blindside people.
Yeah, thanks. I think that would be a great approach. And, because if they get an email from another state, they might not put 2 and 2 together and say, oh, this is because of that project I'm doing with the in-state university. They may not figure that out. So I think that'd be great to just give us all a heads up and reminders and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also working on a landing page for the survey on the PSA website. I'm working with Brian on this so that basically each state would have its, or each region might have its own landing page, so that when farmers click to go to that place, they actually would see all of the regional partners. They would know and associate it with this project. That obviously is important for the PSA farmers. It's also important for the random sample of farmers that might be even less likely to take a random sample from some University of Vermont email address. So we're trying to help them see that if they live in, Tennessee, that actually we have collaborators that we're working in the South, that we're working in different regions. So we're trying to make those connections and connect those dots.
Do we have other questions for the social science team? Don't be shy now.
I may also mention that as Melissa described the Q-sort stuff, we will also be looking for beta testers for that at some point. So if you're interested, let us know. And especially probably for folks that would help distribute and maybe walk participants through the process of completing those Q-sorts. So you wouldn't be responsible for conducting an interview, for example, but helping them sort of figure out the process of doing that sort with the cards. Although Melissa's been testing it with a lot of folks over the course of the last year, and people have found it pretty self-explanatory. She's come up with a great set of directions. But if you're interested in getting involved deeper in that social science side, please let us know.
Yeah, and
could you?
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly reiterate too that we will be looking to extend that data collection beyond the PSA network. And so we'll need conduits for connecting with folks that are outside, so farmers and other stakeholders, industry representatives, even university researchers, although I think they're pretty much all, if they're looking at cover crops, they're all probably here. But folks that extend beyond that network, we'll be looking for people who can help us do that reach and connect us with those folks as well.